I knew something was off the second Chad strolled into my Monday ops meeting sipping a green juice and wearing loafers with no socks. "Just observing," he said, like a fly claiming it had business on your sandwich. No agenda, no intro, no invitation. Just plopped down next to me at the head of the table, like he owned the damn thing. I glanced over at Jeff from finance, who raised his eyebrows just enough to say, "Yeah, this is happening." That was the beginning. The first crack. The tremor before the quake. By Wednesday, my weekly dashboard reports, ones I'd run for 14 years without fail, stopped hitting my inbox. When I pinged IT, they sheepishly said the distribution list had been updated by request of executive leadership. Guess who was now listed as primary reviewer? Chad. The same Chad who thought COGS was a video game and once asked if net margin meant profits after taxes and tips. It didn't stop there. My calendar access changed, quietly. Suddenly, meeting invites I'd personally scheduled were canceled due to conflicting availability, and the reschedules never showed up in my feed. I caught wind of a vendor strategy session that I was supposedly too busy for. Even though I'd built the damn vendor framework from scratch during a recession. I tried confronting the EA team, but they all clammed up like I'd asked who they voted for. And when I emailed Paul, the CEO, to ask what was going on, I got a 2-line reply. "Change is uncomfortable. Trust the process." Translation: shut up and take it. The thing is, I'm not new. I've weathered 4 economic downturns, 2 internal restructures, a supply chain collapse, and a warehouse fire that nearly took out $12 million in product. You don't make it through that much mess without developing a sixth sense for when the air shifts. And this? This wasn't politics. It was a chess move. And I wasn't being outmaneuvered. I was being boxed out. By the end of that week, Chad was shadowing me full-time. Not in a learning capacity either. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't taking notes. He'd just sit in meetings like a smug statue, scrolling LinkedIn between updates and occasionally chiming in with management catchphrases he clearly stole from self-help podcasts. "We need to lean into uncertainty," he said in one meeting, then couldn't explain what our inventory turnover rate was. The staff was confused. They were used to me running a tight ship. And now there was this fresh-faced guy in a designer hoodie nodding sagely at things he didn't understand. A couple managers came to me in private, whispering, "Is he your replacement?" I told them no. Not because I believed it, but because I wasn't about to validate the circus. But deep down, I knew. There was a moment, Thursday afternoon, just after 3 p.m., when it crystallized. I was walking past the executive wing and heard Paul laughing behind his closed door. I slowed. Chad's voice followed. "She's good at the grunt work, but she doesn't get leadership. It's a vibe thing, you know?" I stopped cold. For a second, I thought about bursting in, calling it out, demanding clarity. But I didn't. I stood there, heart pounding, then turned and walked back to my office. Slowly, quietly, because that moment confirmed what I had only suspected before. I wasn't imagining the drift. I was being iced out. Not for lack of performance, not even for conflict, but because someone decided I didn't match the new vibe. I sat at my desk and stared at the framed photo of our original team from 2012, back when we still had folding chairs and ran stand-ups next to the coffee machine. Half those people were gone. The other half barely spoke above whispers now. And Chad? Chad was rising. Fast. Without merit, without respect, and without a clue. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I just opened my personal laptop, pulled up a folder marked contingencies, and started reviewing documents I'd hoped I'd never need. Because if they wanted war, they'd better pray I didn't stay calm. The email landed at 6:08 a.m. sharp, subject line: Leadership Transition Announcement. I was mid-sip on a too-hot coffee when it popped up, and for a second, I thought it was spam. But no. There it was, addressed company-wide from Paul himself, written in that oily tone he reserved for passive-aggressive HR theater. As part of our exciting evolution toward future-focused operations, I'm thrilled to announce the promotion of Chad Whitmore to Executive Director of Strategic Growth and Operations, effective immediately. We thank my full name, first and last, no title, for her years of service and wish her the best in her next chapter. This transition is part of a broader effort to align with our next generation leadership model. No warning. No meeting. No subject line prep. No performance review. No call the night before. Just 14 years of blood, sweat, and 18-hour shifts dismissed like an expired bottle of ranch dressing in the office fridge. By the time I got to the office, the energy was radioactive. People didn't meet my eyes. The interns were whispering behind standing desks. Chad had already moved into my corner office, and the maintenance guy, God bless him, was wheeling out my chair like it had been contaminated. My nameplate was gone, replaced with one that read simply, C. Whitmore. I found Paul in the glass conference room, talking to our general counsel like they were just casually discussing lunch options. He didn't even stand when I knocked and stepped inside. Just gestured toward the hallway like I was a door-to-door salesman pushing a Bible I hadn't read. You could have told me in person, I said. Calm. Controlled. My voice didn't shake, but the rage was thrumming behind my ribs like a snare drum in hell. He smiled like a man about to mansplain gravity. We're moving fast. You know how it is. Then leaned back, arms folded, and delivered the line like he'd been rehearsing it in the mirror. My son will take over. You're not needed here. That was it. No thanks. No handshake. Just smug dismissal from a man whose greatest executive achievement was surviving nepotism and quarterly bourbon tastings. I nodded once. Just once. And I left. No shouting. No tears. No parting speech. I walked to my office. The one now full of Chad's fake plants and a motivational poster that said hustle harder. Grabbed the one box they hadn't already ransacked, and started packing what little they'd left me. A few framed photos. My notepad. A ceramic mug that said COO. Chief of owning it, that now read more like an epitaph. Chad came in while I was boxing up the last of my things. He did that half-limp handshake thing, like he thought we were peers in some Harvard case study. No hard feelings, right? He said, eyes darting between his phone and my face. I just looked at him. Really looked. At his 2 white teeth. At the overpriced haircut. At the puffed-up chest of a man who hadn't earned a single scar. No hard feelings, I said. Some lessons take longer to learn. He chuckled, oblivious. We'll be fine. I left without correcting him. Out in the parking lot, I sat in my car for a full 3 minutes, watching people walk in. People I'd mentored, trained, defended, and in some cases, carried through crises they barely even remember now. No one knew what to say. And I didn't need them to. Because this wasn't my defeat. It was his mistake. And he'd feel it soon enough. Why the following Monday, Chad's grinning mug was splashed across the company website like we'd just acquired a boy band. He was listed as Executive Director of Strategic Growth and Innovation. A title that sounded like someone let ChatGPT rebrand a trust fund baby. The blurb underneath was even worse. Chad Whitmore brings a fresh perspective to operations with his passion for agile leadership and digital native disruption. Translation? He once reposted a Gary Vee video and watched a TED Talk about empathy. Paul, meanwhile, strutted through the building like a rooster on steroids. He was holding impromptu town halls in the break room, talking about bloodline leadership and renewed culture. I overheard him tell the marketing team that the company's soul was finally being restored. That would have been hilarious if it weren't so insulting, like I'd somehow stolen its soul by stabilizing gross margins for 8 straight years. But I wasn't there anymore. Not technically. From a distance, I watched Chad fumble the handoff like a kid trying to juggle chainsaws. He fired 2 long-standing vendor partners, ones I had cultivated through downturns and shortages, because he said their vibe wasn't scalable. He laid off half the field team in Region 3, and tried to replace them with a software rollout that wasn't even out of beta. He called it streamlining. I called it a lawsuit waiting to happen. People started texting me. One of the warehouse managers sent me a screenshot of Chad's email requesting they test run a decentralized shift schedule. Another messaged, "Is it true we're sunsetting half our SKUs?" Someone else, "Do you know what a cross-regional vertical pod is supposed to be?" I didn't answer any of them. Not because I didn't care, but because I couldn't. Not yet. Then came the silence. The board, the same board that had spent the last year nudging Paul toward a graceful exit, was eerily quiet. No statements. No emails. No we thank her for her service. Just the sudden void of institutional memory, like I'd never existed. That's when I got the text. It came from Alyssa Tran, board member, former COO at a Fortune 100, and one of the few people in that building who actually knew what it meant to drag a dying company out of the mud. Alyssa T. Private, please don't talk to the press yet. Trust me. That was it. No context. No emoji. No call. But it was enough to confirm what I'd suspected all along. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You see, Paul didn't know half of what I'd been doing the past 6 months. While he was hosting bourbon nights and bragging about passing the torch, I was in closed-door meetings with the chairman, structuring capital injections, restructuring liabilities, and quietly negotiating an equity option that could have changed everything, had it gone through. But now that I was gone, that option was radioactive. And if Paul had even glanced at my contract, he'd know that firing me without cause nullified his authority in several of those pending negotiations. But he hadn't looked. Of course not. He'd just kicked me out, handed the keys to a legacy intern with a god complex, and expected the building not to burn down. Let it burn. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to leak stories. I didn't need to scream about injustice or sexism, or how many times I'd saved that company from collapse, because they were going to feel it on their own. And when they did, I'd be the only one holding the extinguisher. My home office wasn't fancy, just a spare room with a battered oak desk, a sagging bookshelf, and a corkboard I'd stopped updating sometime around the pandemic. But it was quiet, private, mini. And that night, I sat in it with the lights low, a glass of rye in one hand and my old laptop humming like it knew we were about to resurrect something dangerous. The folder was labeled Cascade. Inside were 7 subfolders: legal, board comms, investor drafts, cap tables, succession notes, equity options, and buried at the bottom like a landmine, executive agreement. I clicked that last one first. The PDF opened slow, like it too was holding its breath. Page 12, paragraph 6, buried in standard HR jargon, sat the phrase I'd highlighted months ago in yellow. In the event of termination without cause, all C-suite level decision-making privileges exercised by the acting CEO relating to pending transactions negotiated in collaboration with the Chief Operating Officer shall be rendered void, subject to board override only through unanimous vote. In plain English, fire me without cause, and Paul loses the steering wheel on anything I'd been touching, including the private equity infusion I'd spent the last 5 months structuring. And I hadn't just touched it, I'd built the damn thing. I closed the file and opened the folder labeled Investor Drafts. Inside were proposal iterations, term sheets, and track change Word docs that read like a thriller for corporate lawyers. I'd worked with the chairman himself on this deal. We kept it close, just him, me, legal counsel, and 2 outside strategists. Paul was intentionally left out. He didn't have the patience for nuance, and frankly, we didn't trust him not to blow it up for optics. He thought investments were for photo ops. I thought they were survival. Our flagship proposal was a $36 million capital injection from a private manufacturing consortium with a controlling interest trigger, one that would have made me the majority shareholder's executive proxy. The ink wasn't dry yet, but we were close. A week, maybe 2. And then Paul fired me. Without cause. Without legal review. Without a single call to the chairman. Which meant every line item in that proposal, every contractual leverage point, every signature waiting to be executed, just got reset to 0. And Paul? He'd just locked himself out of his own house without realizing the spare key was inside my purse. I opened another file, emails between me and Alyssa, redline drafts with comments like, "If we do this right, you'll be the one signing off on his retirement plan." I scrolled through spreadsheets, revised org charts, governance models that showed me taking over within 6 months, if not sooner. Paul had never seen any of it. Because he wasn't supposed to. The board hadn't planned to announce the transition until the funding landed. They were still navigating politics, internal PR, timing. I told them I didn't need a crown, just control. I'd never cared about ego. I cared about the company surviving the next 5 years. But now, thanks to Paul's ego, he'd undone all of it. and the house of cards was about to shake. I leaned back in my chair, stared at the ceiling, and let the silence settle. This wasn't about revenge. This was about precision. Paul had made a decision based on pride. I was about to counter with contract law, market leverage, and 2 NDAs that gave me the authority to speak directly with our lead investors. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to hit send. The next morning started like any other in that building. Cold coffee, muted chatter, the smell of toner and desperation. Chad was holding court in the conference room, trying to explain brand synergy to the logistics team, who looked about as interested as a dog in a math lecture. Paul was doing his usual CEO peacock walk, arms swinging like his Rolex weighed 10 pounds, smiling at interns like he'd just invented leadership. Then the elevator dinged. And everything shifted. The man who stepped out didn't belong to that world, not anymore. He didn't wear the company fleece or sport a lanyard. He didn't check his phone or glance at the receptionist. He walked straight through the glass lobby, past the confused executive assistant, and into the hallway with the calm, heavy tread of a man carrying a loaded weapon no one could see. Edward Halbert, chairman of the board. 40 years of mergers, 2 bankruptcies averted, and one of the last people in that building with more power than Paul. He hadn't stepped foot in the office since before the pandemic. So when he walked in without warning, heads turned. HR went silent. Someone in marketing actually dropped their muffin. Paul spotted him from down the hall and lit up like a Christmas tree on cocaine. Ed, my man, what a surprise. You didn't tell me you were coming in today. He walked up with that fake laugh he always used when he was performing for someone he couldn't control. Just in time to meet the new blood. I've replaced her with my son. He gestured proudly toward Chad, who was still in the glass conference room, drawing a flowchart on the whiteboard that looked like it had been stolen from a TEDx talk on disrupting the disruptors. Edward didn't smile. He didn't shake Paul's hand. He didn't even blink. He just stared at him hard, like he was trying to figure out whether Paul was joking or clinically insane. What have you done? Edward said, low and flat, like a death sentence delivered by a priest. Paul laughed, nervously now, glancing around like the punchline had landed wrong. Ed, come on. You've seen the numbers. She was a legacy operator, stuck in old frameworks. Chad's exactly what this place needs. Youth, vision, digital forward execution. It was time. Edward didn't sit. He didn't nod. He didn't move. He just repeated, slowly this time, each word slicing the air like a scalpel. What have you done? The silence that followed was radioactive. You could feel the air thicken, like the building itself knew a storm had cracked open. Paul's grin faded. His voice dropped a register. We're transitioning leadership. I have full authority. You had authority, Edward cut in, until you fired the only person keeping this company solvent. He paused. Without cause. Paul blinked. What are you? You voided your own executive powers on 6 contracts we're still in the middle of negotiating. Edward finally stepped forward, voice tight. Do you have any idea what you've triggered? Paul paled. Not visibly, not theatrically, but in that subtle, creeping way where the blood starts to retreat behind the eyes, and a man realizes he just pushed a button without reading the label. Edward didn't wait for a reply. He turned toward the glass conference room, where Chad, completely oblivious, was trying to get procurement to brainstorm around synergistic realignment. Edward didn't even acknowledge him. He just looked back at Paul and said, gather the board. Today. Then he left. No gudvie. No handshake. Just walked back into the elevator and disappeared like a ghost who came to deliver a single curse. Paul stood frozen, lips parted like he wanted to say something clever, but there was nothing left in the chamber. And for the first time since I'd been pushed out, I knew. He was scared. Not publicly. Not yet. But the cracks had started. And cracks only go one direction. By noon. The building was humming with the kind of tension you can feel in your molars. People weren't talking, not in the open. But the Slack channels were on fire, and the elevators were suddenly out of service for private use, which in our office meant the board was sequestered upstairs, and Paul was being summoned like a student who'd flunked midterms, but still showed up in a varsity jacket. The boardroom blinds were closed. Unusual. Even during acquisitions, they left them cracked for appearances. But not today. Today, no one was allowed to see what was happening inside. What was visible, however, was the fallout. The first wave hit just after 1 p.m., when our largest client, Landex Industries, froze all ongoing contracts with a single terse email to legal and ops. Subject: contractual concern, immediate hold. Given the recent leadership transition and lack of continuity in strategic oversight, Landex is pausing all projects until further notice. This includes pending POs, fulfillment runs, and cross-team collaboration until clarity is restored. Clarity. That was a polite way of saying, who the hell is in charge over there, and why did you fire the woman holding the threads together? Paul got the email in real time, and according to someone in finance, dropped his phone mid-meeting and walked out without a word. A minute later, IT reported 2 suspended vendor portals. Then 3. Then 6. One of the suspended contracts was tied directly to our Q4 projections, and the penalties alone were enough to trigger a revenue downgrade. But that wasn't even the worst of it. At 3:42 p.m., a second storm rolled in, this one from the investor front. The private consortium I'd been negotiating with sent a formal notice of material disruption, citing termination of the executive counterpart, me, as grounds for immediate suspension of terms. No capital. No equity. No cash cushion. And just like that, the future Paul had been coasting toward, IPO rumors, brand reinvention, keynote spots at conferences, died on the vine. Now here's the kicker. He still hadn't told Chad. Upstairs, Paul was pacing like a man trying to remember CPR on a corpse. But down in the trenches, Chad was scheduling brainstorming sessions titled New Era Vision Sync and asking junior managers to draft thought leadership quotes for his LinkedIn. He held an afternoon stand-up where he explained out loud that metrics are mostly vibes anyway. One of the engineers asked, "What's our updated cost baseline since Region 3 was cut?" Chad replied, "Let's not get bogged down in decimals. Think bigger." By 5 p.m., HR had quietly started compiling a folder labeled Behavioral Feedback. See Whitmore. Anonymous complaints poured in. Some petty. He asked if we have beanbags in the break room yet. Others damning. Tried to cancel a safety audit to save money. And mocked a senior manager during a product review. The office air had shifted. No more fake smiles. No more nodding along. People were watching. Waiting. Because the financials were now bleeding in real time. Forecast dashboards turned red. Slack channels were renamed contingency planning. Procurement sent a cost freeze memo, and the comms team started prepping an internal statement that read like a pre-obituary. Meanwhile, Paul was in the boardroom being handed the receipts, contract clauses, investor timelines, governance rules. Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The numbers were loud enough. And Chad? Chad walked past accounting whistling a Drake song, holding a smoothie and said, "Man, leadership's exhausting." He had no idea. But Paul did. And for the first time in his career, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't a bump. It was a fall. And no one was reaching for the parachute. It was 7:15 a.m. when legal broke the seal. Apparently they'd been reviewing her contract all night. Combed through the fine print, coffee-fueled, triple-checked the footnotes kind of reviewing. And somewhere between page 11 and the appendix, the bomb dropped. Paul had violated not just a line in her agreement. He'd tripped a wire. According to legal's internal memo, one that quietly circulated to board members before sunrise. Her termination without cause didn't just nullify Paul's transactional authority on the deals she was managing. It triggered a mandatory governance review. Automatic. Irrevocable. Per the bylaws, any unauthorized removal of a senior executive involved in active board-sanctioned negotiations required immediate suspension of the CEO's unilateral decision-making privileges until the board could vote. That clause had been buried in the 2019 bylaw update. One Paul had rubber-stamped after skipping the meeting to attend a golf retreat in Scottsdale. And now? That lazy signature was coming back with clause. By 9 a.m., an emergency board session had been called. Not a Zoom. Not a prep call. An in-person, all-hands, behind-closed-doors assembly. No phones. No assistants. Just the board, legal, the chairman and Paul. He was told to arrive by 10. He showed up at 9:45, pale, damp, and wearing a suit that suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. No sign of Chad. This wasn't about Chad anymore. This was about control. About fiduciary responsibility. About a CEO who'd just kicked over a chessboard mid-match without realizing the queen was holding the last move. Inside that boardroom, according to someone who'd peeked through the glass before the blinds were pulled, Paul stood alone while Edward Halberd remained seated, arms folded, flanked by 2 legal advisors and the company's outside counsel. First, they laid out the investor collapse, 36 million vaporized. Then came the contract fallout, vendor destabilization, compliance violations, projected losses. Then, and only then, did legal pass forward the highlighted clause from her executive agreement, underlined in red, with a notation that read, "Violation confirmed. Governance override in effect." Paul tried to spin. He claimed she had resistance to change, that she was hostile to modern innovation, that Chad brought vision. He tried to suggest that culture fit was reason enough. Edward just looked at him and said, "You've destabilized everything we were building." And that was it. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a verdict, not a debate. No votes were taken yet. But the tone had shifted. The authority had changed hands. Paul could feel it. He tried to lean forward, tried to reassert himself with another plea, but even his voice sounded smaller now, like a man pitching a parachute after the plane had already hit the mountain. And across the city, in a sunlit kitchen with coffee brewing and emails pinging in soft rhythm, I sat at my breakfast table, watching, not reacting, not celebrating, not even moving much. I'd received no summons, no call, no request to speak on my behalf. And I didn't need one, because silence, when earned, is louder than any microphone. They knew who to call next. They just hadn't picked up the phone yet. But they would. And when they did, I wouldn't be asking for my job back. I'd be setting the terms. The call came at 6:42 p.m. I was in the middle of cooking dinner. Nothing glamorous, just roasted chicken and some broccoli that was on its last leg, when the phone lit up. Edward Halberd. I let it ring twice. Not out of spite. Just control. Then I picked up, wiped my hands on a towel and said calmly, "Hi, Ed." There was a pause, not long, but long enough for me to taste the weight in his breath. Then he spoke. "Are you still interested in saving this place?" No small talk. No preamble. Just a simple, 6-word question that held behind it the collapse of weeks, the erosion of arrogance, and the moment the tide finally turned. I leaned back against the counter, the kitchen dim except for the glow of the stove. "Yes," I said, "but not as COO." Another pause. "No argument." "We assumed that," he replied. "We're prepared to offer full executive control, interim CEO, with a pathway to permanency after the next shareholder session." I didn't speak. "We'll move to vote your board seat effective immediately," he continued. "You'll have operational sign-off. Chad will be phased out. Paul is no longer leading day-to-day." I nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "I'll need 2 things in writing," I said. "First, that all current contracts Chad touched go through legal review. Second, that my return includes full oversight of investor relations, starting tomorrow." "Done," he said. And just like that, 14 years of thankless labor, 1 week of public erasure, and 3 days of strategic silence pivoted into leverage. I didn't return to applause. No one rolled out a red carpet. I walked into the building the next morning through the side entrance, badge reactivated, no escort needed. Some people stared. Others looked away. The news hadn't hit officially yet. But the tension in the halls said enough. My office wasn't mine anymore, not physically. Chad's stuff was still in there. Hoodie slung over my chair, a protein bar on the desk, his nameplate crooked on the door like a joke that didn't land. I didn't go in. Instead, I went straight to the 19th floor where the board met me in a private session. One by one they nodded. Not out of guilt. These weren't sentimental people, but out of recognition. Real power always returns to competence eventually. Vanity just rents the room for a while. Paul wasn't there. He'd been asked not to attend. His formal review was scheduled for next week. Until then, Special advisor was his new title. A leash tied to a chair with no legs. Chad, for his part, was scheduled to transition out over the next 14 days. But I'd already asked legal to freeze his access to operational systems. He could keep his LinkedIn updates. That was about it. HR sent out the first announcement before noon. We welcome back name. In a new executive capacity to lead our stabilization and growth initiatives. I didn't smile. Didn't preen. I just got to work. By lunch, I was already in meetings with finance, legal, and comms. I redlined Chad's restructuring mess and reactivated 2 vendor contracts he'd carelessly torched. I scheduled a direct call with Landex for 7 a.m. the next day. I reviewed the paused investor deal and added 2 addendums, my terms this time. No speeches. No I told you so. Just motion. Precision. Control. Because when you return from exile, you don't come back with fireworks. You come back with firewood and a match. The boardroom was colder than I remembered. Not in temperature. Climate control was still broken in half the building, but in tone. Clean. Sparse. Every chair perfectly aligned. Not a pin out of place. A stage set for consequence. When I walked in, no one stood. That was fine. I didn't need performance. I needed position. Edward nodded toward the seat at the head of the table. Not my old seat, the one 3 places down, right hand to the king. The seat. I took it without hesitation. To my left, legal counsel shuffled papers. To my right, Alyssa Tran gave me the slightest tilt of her head, eyes calm but steeled. Across from me sat Paul. Deflated. Still in the CEO suit, but now it looked like borrowed armor, something worn by a man hoping cloth could still confer power. The swagger was gone. His hair, usually sprayed to oblivion, now wilted. No hombres, nos mages mirk. Just a man staring at the seat he thought would never be pulled out from under him. Before we begin, he started, voice low. I want to. No need, I interrupted. The room froze for a beat. He blinked. Swallowed. I leaned forward, voice measured. You replaced me with someone who couldn't even open my calendar. Not a raised voice. Not an insult. Just the truth. There was no reply. What could he say? That Chad thought QBR meant quick business returns? That he missed a legal filing deadline because he was too busy drafting a team-building scavenger hunt? That he tried to pitch a blockchain idea to a logistics client who still ran on fax machines? The silence hung heavy. Then Edward cleared his throat and began the session. It was procedural. Clean. Acknowledgement of new operational authority. A unanimous vote to confirm interim CEO appointment with fast track to permanent. A formal censure placed on Paul, pending full review of governance breach. No ceremony. Just signatures. And in the middle of it all, Chad's name never came up. Not once. His chair sat empty, his badge already deactivated, his future somebody else's liability. That, in the end, was the real justice. Not that they'd been punished loudly, but that they'd become irrelevant. Forgotten footnotes in a ledger too important to leave in reckless hands. When the meeting adjourned, no one clapped. They just rose, filed out, and left me alone in the room. I stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the city, 30 floors up, glass streaked with late afternoon haze. 14 years. One quiet exile. And now I stood where I was always meant to. Not because I demanded it, but because when the smoke cleared, I was the only one left holding the damn map. He thought bloodline was strategy. Turns out, experience has a longer legacy.